All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Seattle Children's and University of Washington Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Grand Rounds. We're excited to welcome Dr. Joshua Wartzel, who will be talking about climate change and mental health. But before we get going with an introduction, we'll start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as one way to honor the land we are on and resist cultural erasure. We also acknowledge that this country exists and prospered as the result of the free enslaved labor of Black people. We honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, knowledge, and skills that have been stolen due to violence and systemic oppression. We affirm our commitment to be aware of privilege and oppression and how they play a role in the lives of patients, families, and employees as we strive to be anti-racist and improve care for those with less privilege. And as we like to do with Grand Rounds, we highlight important cultural opportunities and events happening in the month of our talk. And of course, we've got a big one here in January. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is going to be on the Monday, the 19th this year. And wanted to point out that both the University of Washington and Seattle Children's have published some opportunities to engage in public service on this important day of remembrance. All right, well now, as you guys have probably surmised, we do not shy away from the hot issues of the day here at Seattle Children's Grand Rounds, and this month is no different. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Joshua Wartzel to our Grand Rounds series today. His talk will be Too Hot to Handle: The Impacts of Climate Change on Mental Health. A little bit about Dr. Wartzel. So he got his bachelor's degree at Harvard, where he studied human developmental and regenerative biology. Then he jumped to the other Cambridge in the UK and got a master's of philosophy in translational medicine and therapeutics. Before ultimately getting his MD degree at Stanford. He did his residency in at the University of Rochester in psychiatry and his child and adolescent psychiatry fellowship at Brown. And he's currently an adjunct assistant professor at Yale in Connecticut. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Wartzel. Thank you for being here.
There we go. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all today. And I look forward to talking with you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is looking at how climate change or environmental change in general is in fact affecting our mental health. So I think we're all very aware of the realities of our time. We're having ocean level rise and glacier melting, more extreme weather, the forest fires that are affecting the West, and more extreme temperatures that are affecting almost everywhere. And this has profound impacts on how our society works, but also our mental health. There are three buckets that I think of when I compartmentalize the effects of climate on mental health. The first are biological impacts of things like temperature and toxins that impact how our brains function and the pathophysiology of mental illness. There are psychological ramifications of natural disasters and existential distress about climate change. And there also are ways in which, as physicians and mental health providers, we can engage in sustainable action. I'm going to focus today on these first two buckets because sustainable action could be a talk unto itself. But I just want to put a pin in that for people who are interested. So let's start with the first bucket, looking at the biological impacts of climate change on mental health. And today I'm going to focus on three of those ripple effects of climate change on mental health, and that includes extreme heat, smoke and fine particulate matter, and just a smattering of other environmental factors that just gives you a potpourri of some of the other things we can think about. My research in my lab looks specifically at how heat impacts mental health, and so you'll see that the lion's share of this portion is about that, but we'll touch on the others as well. So first, extreme heat effects on mental health. Now, there is a growing and quite robust epidemiological literature looking at how higher temperatures during the year seem to be associated with a number of negative mental health outcomes. We're looking here at data during heat waves, and this is actually a relatively loosely defined term defined differently in different parts of the world. But where I'm at in the Northeast, it's 3 days or more of temperatures that are 90 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. And what you find is that as temperatures go even higher during those periods, there are linear relationships with things like violent crime, rape, and suicide. We see that these patterns also occur just more generally during warmer times of the year. So these are data taken from 3 different studies. The first is looking at suicide data over a 10-year period in Italy, violent suicides, and you can see that in general, those rates go up during the spring and summer months, and dramatically so in men, but also in women. This is a study looking at hospitalization rates for mania in Egypt, and they find that the highest rates of hospitalization occur during the spring and summer. And this is looking at PTSD exacerbations in a New Jersey Veterans Hospital, and you find that similar temporal pattern. A lot of my work has looked at how heat impacts young people. And so I'll talk through 2 studies that I've done to look at this. In one study, we looked at national data from the CDC on completed suicide in 1980 to 2004. We use this date range because we have some of the best temperature and environmental information from that time period. And after 2004, there's more blinding of, on a county level, how many people died by suicide. So you can see we look at suicide rates by county. We match that to temperature data on the county level, averaged across the month. And then we control for a number of different potential confounders with fixed effects, things like the variables that you might find on a state level and within a year, as well as county month. And ultimately, we conducted regression to try to identify whether there was an association between suicide completion and average monthly temperature on the county level. What we found was that when you look at young people, so 24 and younger, that there seems to be a dramatic impact of temperature on suicide during the summer, but not statistically so during other times of the year. So when you look at 24-year-olds, you'll see that there's like a 2.7% increase in suicide rates for every 1 degree Celsius change above average monthly temperatures. And that's significantly different than what we see during other seasons. We then did a subsequent analysis looking at age strata. So across the life spectrum, how unique is this to young people? And we also divided young people into those that were 14 or younger and 15 to 24. And what we found was that while this elevated risk was seen in both the younger and older youth, that really we only reach statistical significance when we look at young adults, so 15 to 24, and that in fact actually the risk per 1 degree Celsius increase goes up even more to 3% for every 1 degree Celsius increase in average monthly temperature. Now you might say, Josh, okay, great, 3%, what does that really mean? Well, what we find is that actually suicide rates go up by roughly 3% after large natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. So that means that for every 1 degree Celsius increase above average monthly temperatures, we're having a Katrina level effect on suicide rates in young adults. Now, I'm very interested in trying to understand why that might be. And there are interesting data that suggests that people with mental health have difficulties with temperature regulation at baseline. So going back all the way to 1890, we've seen that patients with depression have decreased skin conductance, which is a measure of sweat. And it's also been observed in other patient populations, those with bipolar disorder, patients with depression and panic disorder, as well as suicidal patients. And in fact, if you look at patients with depression's core body temperature, it's elevated relative to healthy controls. Similarly, we've seen aberrancies in temperature regulation in people with schizophrenia. So actually going all the way back to the 1930s and 40s, they were using hydrotherapy because they were noticing that there were these differences in how well patients could regulate their temperature. So in the pre-neuroleptic era, they were finding that there were decreased baseline temperatures relative to healthy controls, that there was dyssynchrony in the circadian peaks in temperature. We know that actually one of the core features of being able to fall asleep is how we shunt temperature from our core to our periphery and lower our core body temperature. And that seemed to be disrupted in patients with schizophrenia. And also that there was an impaired ability to cool when they were heat stressed. So frankly, I did not know much about how neurotransmitters were fundamentally involved in thermoregulation prior to delving into this research. And I just wanted to give you a little glimpse into how something as fundamental as serotonin, which we're manipulating all the time with our medicines, is in regulating temperature. So our bodies are sensing external temperatures through thermosensitive proteins in the skin. And these proteins are then collecting that information, which gets sent up through the spinal cord, through lamina 1 in the dorsal horn, and then through the spinal brachial pathway in the spinal cord. And that's shown here in this kind of maroonish color. This synapses onto the lateral spinal brachial nucleus, which in turn synapses onto the dorsal raphe nucleus, which of course is one of the main production centers of serotonin in the brain. Now, the dorsal raphe nucleus synapses directly onto the hypothalamus, which we also know is kind of the body's main thermostat. And depending upon what part of the hypothalamus is stimulated by the dorsal raphe nucleus, we get different heat physiology behaviors, or heat physiology and behaviors. If you stimulate the preoptic area, here shown in red or pinkish red, you get heat dissipation physiology, so things like vasodilation and panting, and then maybe panting a little less so in humans, but in other animals. And then in the posterior area, if there's stimulation, you get heat conservation physiology, so shivering or heat vasoconstriction. So serotonin fundamentally involved in how the core thermostat of our body is regulating our temperatures. But neurotransmitters across the board are involved with this process. So norepinephrine and epinephrine control vasoconstriction peripherally through alpha-1 and alpha-2 signaling. We also know that they stimulate brown fat to promote thermogenesis. Acetylcholine through muscarinic stimulation controls sweat release. GABA is involved with vasodilation and cooling. And glutamate is that neurotransmitter throughout the spinal thalamic pathway that's communicating all that information about temperature from the periphery. So you might imagine then that when we're prescribing medicines that are tinkering with all of these neurotransmitters, we're fundamentally impacting how the body is both recognizing and responding to ambient temperature. So we see this play out in terms of the side effects that the medicines we prescribe have. When we look at SSRIs and TCAs, 10% of people on SSRIs and 14% on TCAs report increased sweating. And this is a table just documenting the incidence of sweating as a side effect with a range of different antidepressants. Of course, we know that when we prescribe, hopefully we're not prescribing, when people take SSRIs in excess or TCAs, that they can have serotonin syndrome. And this has to do with both peripheral and central serotonin receptors that are being stimulated in that context. And interestingly, if you look at patients with depression who have been treated with SSRIs, their core body temperatures, which at baseline are elevated, normalize. So they're thermoregulating better when they're on SSRIs, and this actually seems to be corresponding to their remission of depression symptoms as well. So perhaps chicken or the egg, but when people have improvement in their depression, they also seem to have better improvement in their thermoregulation. Now, a number of other psychotropics may have negative impacts on thermoregulation. So this was a study done looking at hospitalization rates across France, but they looked at people on antipsychotics, antihistamines, and anticholinergics who were coming into the hospital for heat-related morbidity and mortality. And what they found was that patients on these agents had increased odds of hospitalization. Patients on antipsychotics had six-fold higher odds of being hospitalized for heat stroke and 4.6-fold higher odds if they were on anticholinergics. Now, I think that at the core here is we're seeing a lot of phenomenology, right? These are associations on an epidemiological level, but we're really lacking an understanding of the mechanism of how temperature may be impacting mood. We could imagine that there are direct mechanisms. Some of these seem to bear out based on animal studies, but also just on some of the functional imaging that we've done to see how, for example, serotonin is so involved with thermoregulation. So it may be that we're changing neurotransmitter levels when we are either very hot or taking medicines that may impact our ability to thermoregulate. There's interesting literature showing that functional connectivity in the brain changes when you're hot. And so it may be that we're less able to utilize rational thought, or we might be more impulsive, which makes us more likely to engage in self-harm. There may be some neuroinflammation that occurs from heat stress, and then also brain oxygenation may change as temperatures increase. But there also are a number of indirect mechanisms that may be impacting mental health, and it's these that my lab is focusing on. So some of these pathways include how heat may be impacting sleep, cognition, or physical activity, all of which we know independently can impact mood. So we'll walk through it briefly. We know that sleep-wake disturbances are risk factors for mood disorders. We also see that they can be part of the constellation of symptoms of mood disorders. We know that experimentally, when you increase temperatures that people are sleeping in, sometimes it's helpful just to put this in Fahrenheit because that's what we tend to think in more. We're looking at here roughly like getting to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You have a decrease in total sleep time. There's a decrease in sleep quality and increased wakefulness during the biological night. And we know that nighttime wakefulness is a critical vulnerability period for many people. There is kind of a nadir in cognitive function and emotional function. There are severe impairments in executive function, kind of termed hypofrontality, but also with mood regulation and impulse control. And actually, there have been some studies that have looked at this period called the mind after midnight, which shows that for those who are awake after midnight, there can be anywhere from a 5 to 18-fold higher incidence of suicidal behaviors during those times. We also know that heat can impact cognition, and cognitive changes can be a precursor to and symptoms of mood disorders. Heat stress has been shown to have impacts on attention-demanding tasks, but also on speed and accuracy. So, for example, they've done studies of people taking tests in heated lab spaces. And if you increase the temperature by anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, or roughly 10 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, you get, relatively modest change in cognitive performance, so anywhere from less than a percentage to 5%. But these can be cumulative, and the longer that you're in that space at that higher temperature, the worse your cognitive function can be. It seems like there's a bell-shaped curve, so the colder it is too after a certain point, you also have negative cognitive effects. And the sweet spot of ideal function is this 20 to 22 degrees Celsius, and that's roughly around 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We also know that the hotter it is outside, the less we are able to engage in physical activity, and this is important for mental health as well. There's an inverse relationship between physical activity and depression and anxiety. We know that physical activity is thought to improve mental disturbance through a number of mechanisms, whether it's a distraction technique from negative rumination to production of beneficial mood elevating neurotransmitters to also just promoting behavioral activation and higher energy. When you look at people in environments that get warmer above that like 80-degree Fahrenheit range, the number of people and the duration of time that they're exercising starts to decrease. And that's even more profound in older adults, but we see it in young folks too. So all of this is to say that there may be these indirect means by which temperature is impacting mood through how temperature impacts sleep, cognition, and physical activity. So my lab started by trying to assess this indirect pathway through some pilot testing of observational data. So we looked at basically a case control study of around 5,600 young people ages 3 to 18 who came into the psychiatric emergency department over whatever it was, 3.5 year period. And we cataloged whether they were suicidal or not suicidal. And our analysis looked at the likelihood of presenting with suicidality, incorporating weekly minimum temperature at home addresses. So why minimum temperature? This is a proxy for nighttime temperature. So the coldest times of day typically happen at night. We looked at patients' reports of insomnia. So in our emergency department, everyone is asked about their sleep, and specifically there's a drop-down menu of insomnia, hypersomnia, or no issues with sleep. And then we included demographic information that was available in the chart, their diagnoses, and environmental factors that we were able to glean from their at-home address that was also in the chart. So we were able to gather data through GIS about their environment at home. And ultimately, we looked at both moderation and mediation effects of how temperature impacts mental health through insomnia. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. So when we look at moderation, we're looking at basically if you have insomnia versus if you don't have insomnia, and are there differences in the relationship between temperature and suicide in those two populations? And what we found was that there was an increased risk of having suicidality if you were in the insomnia group. So if you came into the ED and you said you had insomnia, you were more likely to be impacted by temperature than if you came into the ED and said you didn't have insomnia. And just to graphically depict this, this is looking at all the people who were reporting insomnia when they came into the ED in red and no insomnia in blue. The x-axis is showing the 7-day average minimum temperature at their home address, and the y-axis is showing the percentage of those coming in with suicidality in those two groups. And what you can see is that if you didn't have insomnia, you basically were at a flat line. There was not really an association at all with minimum temperature. But if you did have insomnia, there was a linear relationship such that there was a slight increase, a slope for most of the temperature range, with a more pronounced impact of temperature as you got to the highest range of temperature. Now, we also looked at mediation, and mediation is trying to assess more mechanism. And I'll explain this and kind of what the mathematics is trying to get at. So with mediation, we're looking at how the relationship between an exposure variable like temperature impacts an outcome variable like suicide. And so we're interested in whether an intermediary variable, like insomnia in this case, may be actually carrying the main, whether it is the explanation for the association between temperature and suicide. So specifically, does temperature impact insomnia, which in turn impacts suicidality? And does that account for the relationship that we're seeing between temperature and suicide? So in fact, that is what we saw. Oops, there we go. If you look at the relationship between temperature and its impacts on insomnia, there was a significant effect of how increased temperatures made it so people were more prone to insomnia. Those with insomnia were more prone to have higher presentations for suicidality. And when we looked at this combined indirect effect, it was significant that temperature was impacting suicidality through the impact that temperature was having on insomnia. And more importantly, what we found was that after accounting for this indirect pathway, the association between temperature and suicidality no longer was significant. And that's what we see through just this analysis up here. So the association of temperature on suicidality seemed to be entirely conducted through how temperature was impacting insomnia. Now, caveats abound with use of mediation analysis. This is a crossover study. We're not able to see temporal resolution about whether temperature impacted sleep, which impacted suicidality. But mathematically, this suggests that there is something there to explore. So we applied for funding to the Wellcome Trust, and there was a call for research looking at how there may be mechanisms that drive heat's impacts on mental health. And we were looking at sleep, cognition, and physical activity as mediating pathways. And so in a collaboration between my clinical institution at Hartford Healthcare and my academic appointment at Yale, we were very excited to be able to get funding through the Wellcome Trust to start the Heat Mind Lab. And we're conducting 2 studies to try to really address, or rather parse, these mechanisms. And I'll just briefly outline these 2 studies for you. One is an ecological study, and the other is a laboratory-based study. So in the first study, we are looking at 1,000 young adults with depression, with or without anxiety, from across the United States, and we're going to be monitoring them remotely with wearable devices. We're going to be looking at them during the summer and gathering data for 4 weeks, consecutive weeks. So the data we're gathering come from a number of different devices. For environmental monitoring, we're using a Bluetooth thermometer hygrometer, which is going to give us actual experienced temperature and humidity 24/7. So most of the studies to date have just looked at basically weather stations and imputing what someone's exposure to temperature would be based on what's going on in a much larger area outside. That's not at all really what's going on the individual experience level. We're going to be gathering physiological data from wearable actigraphy, a Fitbit device that's going to let us look at sleep, but it's also going to let us look at heart rate and even skin temperature. And we're also going to be gathering a lot of psychological data from surveys they complete on their phones, ecological momentary assessments. And these will be happening 4 times a day. The phone also allows us to gather other interesting information, so we can gather their geolocation, and use that to look at how much time they spent indoors versus outside, their exposure to green space. And also, the camera allows us to see what sunlight or light exposure is when the phone is unlocked. We're also going to be gathering qualitative data from these individuals, asking them to complete an audio diary at the end of the observation period. So that's study 1. Study 2 is trying to, in a more controlled environment, get at how temperature impacts mood. And so we're going to be conducting basically a mini version of study 1, but with some added fun in the sleep lab. We're getting 50 young adults with depression, with or without anxiety. It's going to be happening at their home environments throughout Connecticut, but also 2 weekends in the sleep lab at Yale, surrounded by the 4 weeks of home monitoring, and this will also happen during the summer. And in the lab, they're their own controls, so it's a crossover study. One weekend, they're going to be having daytime heat exposures of 32 degrees Celsius, or roughly 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with more moderate nighttime temperatures. And then the flip for the other weekend, moderate daytime temperatures with nighttimes that are hot. We're going to be gathering data in a variety of ways. We have physiological monitoring that's going to be through EEG polysomnography. We're going to be gathering data on their sleep, as well as spot EEGs during the day to see how functional connectivity might be changing with heat exposure. We're going to be gathering temperature through both peripheral temperature sensors that are going to be taped to multiple parts of their body, but also they're going to be ingesting a temperature probe to get their core body temperature at all times. We're going to be using actigraphy as well, just to monitor their heart rate, but also to just make sure that we're basically verifying the quality of the data we're getting in study 1. And then we're going to be using the same EMA surveys to gather psychological data. I also should mention actually that in the EMA, we're going to be doing cognitive assessments in both studies as well to look at how cognition may be changing in exposure to temperature. And then at the end of the observations during the weekends, we're going to be gathering qualitative data through interviews with the participants. So we'll tell you, hopefully in the next couple of years, what we find from all of that. But the ultimate goal is that we will be able to start to find mechanisms that then lend credence to developing interventions to help people who are facing heat to assist them with their mental health. And this might be anything from a cooling pillow to different low-tech cooling strategies that can keep their environments cooler while they're sleeping, if sleep seems to be important. We're hoping to create data sets that are very rich in ways that current ecological studies can't achieve with just, like I was alluding to, the ways that temperature are collected currently. And we also want to educate the public, and for young people in particular, that's not through just journal articles and presenting at conferences, but through social media and other accessible means. And then ultimately, we want to be able to provide clinical guidelines for providers because currently we don't have any way of really more than just kind of a hand wavy, make sure you're telling patients to stay hydrated and keep cool. What can we actually do with evidence to help them during heat waves? And this could also be on a population level information that we could convey through their phones. So I promise you that all of the sections are not that long, but just to briefly summarize about extreme heat. We know epidemiologically that there are strong links between elevated temperatures, both acutely during heat waves, but also more broadly during the summer, and poor mental health outcomes, ranging from suicidality to hospital presentations. We know that patients with mental illness have difficulties regulating their temperature at baseline, and the medicines that we prescribe may further exacerbate that, but in cases like SSRIs may help it as well. We know that there are likely many both direct and indirect pathways by which temperature is impacting those mental health outcomes, but we're just at the cusp of understanding them. And so research, like some of the studies that I've described, will hopefully push that field forward and then allow us to start creating informed interventions to support these patients. So let's now move on to briefly looking over how smoke and fine particulates have been associated with mental health outcomes. So airborne pollutants range the gamut. Fine particulates have been studied most, but even that there are 10 micron fine particulates, and these 2.5 PM 2.5 looks at these even smaller particles that are smaller than red blood cells and have been found to percolate in tissues across the body. We see that, and I have ozone here too, because that's just another element that, or not element, another factor atmospherically that has been shown to be associated with forest fires and burning fossil fuels, and that has negative health outcomes. But I'm going to focus on PM 2.5 just for the sake of time. So we know that across the life spectrum, exposure to PM 2.5 has been negatively associated with health outcomes. In fetuses, there's higher risk of intrauterine growth restriction, preterm birth, and low birth weight. Children have a higher risk of developmental delays, reduced IQs, even higher risk for ASD and ADHD. In adults, we see higher rates of depression, suicide, bipolar disorder, and violence in those who have been exposed to higher PM 2.5. And in the geriatric population, lifetime exposure has been associated with higher odds of dementia, in particular, Alzheimer's. Now, big caveat, association studies do not prove causation. We know that, while we try to control for things like socioeconomics, oftentimes, if you are living by a highway, you are there because of poverty, redlining, any number of social determinants of health. So it can always be difficult to disambiguate that from this. But it does seem like even when we try to account for those through regressions, that the impact of PM 2.5 is strong. When we look at the pathophysiology of this, we know that PM 2.5 crosses the blood-brain barrier and can release pro-inflammatory mediators and reactive oxygen species. And these have been shown to be core elements of mental health disorders. There are also structural and functional changes that we see in several regions of the brain. The anterior cingulate cortex, which is central for emotional processing. Overall cortical thickness and white matter volume seems to be reduced in those who have higher exposure. And interestingly, in those who have polygenic risk, so genetic markers of depression, exposure to higher levels of PM2.5 in those individuals seems to be associated with greater impacts on working memory and stress-related messaging in cortical and subcortical brain networks. So there's probably a polygenic plus environmental interaction that can make those individuals more impacted by PM2.5. What do we do about this? Thankfully, we can dramatically decrease our exposure in indoor settings through filters and electrostatic precipitators. This can decrease levels from 40 to 70%, depending upon the brand. We know that masking can also dramatically decrease what you're inhaling, anywhere up to 98% of what's in the air. And this has to do with just how many layers of material are in the mask and how it's used. And just to say that even the simple surgical masks that we use can reduce it by over half. We often want to make sure that we're aware of what the atmospheric conditions are, which can vary by day. I know that where I'm from in the Northeast, and I'm sure you guys as well were affected by the fires in Canada and out west. But during those forest fires, air quality can decrease dramatically, and there can be higher rates, higher levels of PM2.5. So on those days in particular, advising patients to try to minimize their time outside, or if they do, to wear masks. So that's a brief overview. That could be a talk unto itself, but just to say that the smoke and fine particulates that are created through the burning of fossil fuels and the forest fires that are secondary to climate change, that too has negative impacts on mental health across the life spectrum. But thankfully, we can try to minimize our exposure through some of what we described with filters and masks. So I wish I had another couple of hours to go through some of these other topics, but just to give you a smattering of the myriad other ways that climate change can impact mental health directly, I'll go through a couple. So one is nutritional impacts. Increased CO2, interestingly, can change the concentration of macro and micronutrients in food. And that, in particular, we look at proteins, zinc, and iron. I think someone may not be muted, so just be mindful of your mics. We also want to just take into account that as aridity changes and the ability to cultivate crops changes, there are also going to just be instances of malnutrition because we'll have greater food insecurity. But I think I was particularly interested in how even the food that we grow, the nutritional content of that food may change as CO2 levels change. This has been looked at experimentally. They've grown crops in lab settings where the atmosphere is containing the CO2 predicted by 2050. And what they find is that the nutritional content goes down by 4 to 13%. In red, we see protein level, iron is in blue, and zinc in gray. And we're looking at anything from wheat to soybeans. What does this mean, right? Most of us are eating fortified foods like cereals, so we may not be directly impacted if our broccoli has a little less iron. But for most of the world, they get all of their nutrition from the food that they grow. And so this can have significant impacts. And just to show you a little bit of literature about how vitamin deficiencies impact mental health, we'll focus on iron. We see that iron is fundamental in monoamine neurotransmitter levels, as well as just myelination in the brain. And so when there is iron deficiency, we see that children and adolescents have increased rates of psychiatric disorders and cognitive developmental delay. This is a large retrospective case control study looking at those with or without iron deficiency in Taiwan. And what you find is that those with unipolar depression have an increased odds of having iron deficiency. Same is true for bipolar disorder, almost six-fold higher odds, and autism as well, over threefold odds. Same caveat that I've been giving with everything about association studies, but it's compelling that we as psychiatrists should be thinking about how climate change may be impacting our patients' food and mental health. We know that as climates change, where bugs live and the diseases they carry will change as well. Again, just thinking about my neck of the woods, where Lyme disease, I grew up in Pennsylvania, was endemic there and has been, but the range with where ticks are living has changed dramatically just over the past couple of decades because it's been getting warmer and seasons have been longer. Warmer seasons have been longer. So we know that as the climate warms, we're having changing time spans and geographic ranges of where disease vectors live. Arthropods like ticks for Lyme disease are dependent on external temperatures for their survival, their feeding, and their reproduction. But I think what gets talked about less is actually the little pathogens within those bugs also are temperature dependent. So the life cycles of the little spirochetes that carry Lyme also have accelerated reproduction and proliferation within those vectors, the warmer it is. So what's anticipated is that there will be an additional 500 million people at risk of these zoonotic illnesses by 2050 based on changes in climate. The WHO has identified 11 vector-borne diseases that are of major concern for environment due to environmental change, and most of those can cause encephalitis and encephalopathy. So something to keep in our differentials. When we think about interventions, what do we do? And many of you probably are already doing this, but checking vitamin deficiencies and thinking broadly, many of us don't typically look for zinc, but I've been trying to add that to the panel that I look at with my patients and to supplement as needed. For zoonotic illnesses, we're making sure we're educating patients about their risk. Fauci got West Nile virus, I believe, just sitting in his backyard in Washington, D.C. We need to make sure we're telling people to apply bug repellents. There's pretty good data on DEET and Picaridin, reducing the risk of zoonotic illnesses, and this has been shown to be safe in babies over 2 months old and pregnant and breastfeeding women. So again, this is just whetting your appetite, hopefully, for investigating further how there are ripple effects of climate change impacting biology and mental health. We've talked about extreme heat, smoke, and nutrition, forest fires, nutrition and zoonotic illnesses. Now let's move to psychological impacts. So when I think about psychological impacts from climate change, I group it into two buckets. There are acute and chronic environmental traumas, and then there is this category of environmental distress that has to do with kind of existential worries as we see what's going on in the world around us. I will focus primarily on that second one, but I'll briefly review the environmental traumas. So acute versus chronic environmental traumas, what do I mean by that? Well, acute exposures are kind of what may be more intuitive when you think about a natural disaster. A hurricane hits an area, an area has severe flooding. But chronic exposures are often slower moving disasters, and oftentimes these two go hand in hand. So a chronic exposure might be, that there's been repeated drought in an area, and there has been creeping ocean level rise, and there are areas that are having kind of recurring flooding. Oftentimes, you'll have an area that may have chronic exposure punctuated by acute exposures, and I'll use Maui as an example. So for years, Maui had drought that was both due to climate change, but also humans in the agricultural sector siphoning water away from certain parts of the island. This changed how vegetation was kind of accumulating that was dry and flammable. And then you have a hurricane off the coast, which, while it doesn't strike the coast, it creates very high winds that allow for sparks to carry and cause devastating fires across the island. So chronic punctuated by acute. Now, the effects of these environmental traumas are often similar to some of the other traumas that we think about in PTSD and other trauma-related disorders, and they compound. So there are increased rates of PTSD, anxiety, and depression following these natural disasters. We see increased rates of interpersonal violence, including child abuse and gender-based violence, increased substance use, and we know that children are at increased risk just because of the impact of ACEs on mental health in a way that may be more pronounced than we see with adults undergoing the same traumas. What do we do about disaster-related mental health sequelae? Well, one thing that's been found to be interesting, and this has come out of both qualitative data looking at kids who have lived through natural disasters, but also intervention work where they've tried to proactively help communities who are at risk of natural disasters, is coming up with a to-go bag. And it sounds straightforward, but basically if a child knows that there's a plan and that if something happens, they have some tools at their disposal, they know where to meet up with family if they get separated, that this can be both beneficial in anticipation of a natural disaster and during the natural disaster. There also are a number of different phone apps that have been developed because we know that during natural disasters, well, actually at baseline, there are limited access points to mental health treatment, but during a natural disaster, that gets disrupted even further. But phone apps can provide a number of different mental health resources through psychoeducation, as well as kind of a step-by-step protocol with CBT to help people cope. So I'll list a few of these here, but these have some good data behind them to help communities manage during a natural disaster. And actually, some of these also have downloadable versions. So even if Wi-Fi and internet access goes, they'll have access to it on their phones. And just I'm reiterating here that the treatments that have been so well studied to look at how we treat PTSD and ACEs in other contexts likely have applicability in this context as well. So just to briefly say that we know that environmental change is leading to increased rates and severity of natural disasters across the world. As some of you may have heard, we were talking about in Seattle how there has been more devastating flooding. These once 1 in 100-year events are now becoming more common. And we know that these have effects on mental health through trauma and through the many ripple effects of trauma, whether it's other forms of abuse through child abuse and drug use. And we need to think about how we can intervene through interventions that are both novel to natural disasters, so things like the to-go bag, but also our standard care for those who have experienced trauma. So let's focus now on environmental distress or existential distress in the face of climate change, because I think this is a little bit more set apart from what you might have seen from kind of more of this conventional trauma exposure stuff. So what is environmental distress or climate distress or eco-anxiety? You may have seen these terms thrown around. Basically, eco-anxiety relates to the anxiety that someone feels directly related to the degradation of environment. My colleagues and I in this space have started to lean toward using a broader term, so environmental distress or climate distress. And that's because the types of emotional responses to climate change can be more nuanced than just anxiety. This includes things like sadness, anger, and grief. Another question or a question that we are often asked is climate distress a disorder? And I think fundamentally, we don't want to pathologize people's worries about climate change. It's a natural response to a crisis to be worried about what's going on. Rather, we want to highlight that this is an entity that many of our patients may be experiencing, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the epidemiology of how the prevalence of this might be higher than we otherwise would expect. But we also want to offer strategies for coping. Now, that being said, we know that when people have anxiety, this can become clinical anxiety or depression and even suicidality. And so when climate-related distress can contribute to those clinical outcomes, then treatment is indicated. So, how common is climate distress? Well, when people have surveyed youth from across the globe, they have found that, and this is specifically looking at young adults, 16 to 25, that 84% are at least moderately worried about climate change. And actually, nearly 60% are very to extremely worried about climate change. Over half think that they will personally be harmed by climate change over the course of their lives. And 45% say that their worries about climate change affect their day-to-day life and functioning. When you look by socioeconomic or GDP rather of countries, you see that those that are in a lower GDP have an even higher likelihood of saying that they think their daily life and functioning is affected by climate change. What about in the US? So there was a study just 2 years ago now that looked at climate anxiety prevalence across the United States. And what they found in that same demographic of 16 to 25-year-olds was that climate distress was quite common. In fact, across the board, anywhere from 75 to 90% of youth were saying they were at least moderately worried about climate change. Now, as we might imagine, because climate change is a politicized term, there is a little bit of regional clustering. In the South and Midwest, we see slightly lower levels of climate anxiety, but with some notable exceptions. Texas was the second most anxious state about climate change, and Florida was in the top 10. And I think this has to do with the reality that these people are facing, where natural disasters are more frequent. A small minority of people across the board are not worried about climate change, anywhere from 2 to 7%. People want to talk about their climate distress. When some colleagues out of Yale surveyed individuals across the age spectrum, they found that in the United States, roughly 8% of people they surveyed would be interested in talking about climate change with a therapist. Now, this differed a bit by demographic. So if you looked at Hispanic respondents, they were 4 times as likely as white respondents, and Black respondents were twice as likely as white respondents to want to talk about their climate distress in therapy. Similarly, if you looked by age group, young people, Gen Zs, and millennials were 3 times as likely as baby boomers and the silent generation to want to talk about climate distress. So it's one thing to talk about existential distress or climate distress as a phenomenon of non-clinical symptoms, but I was particularly interested in how people with mental illness might be clinically impacted by climate distress. So kind of thinking back to that slide where I said that climate distress is not a diagnosis, but there's some people who may have clinical levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidality related to their distress. That population had not been studied, so I was curious to investigate that. So during my fellowship, I received a pilot grant through ACAP to do just that. And I surveyed 250 young people in mental health treatment at a variety of different settings, from outpatient to inpatient levels of care. And we looked at their anxiety levels at baseline and found that there was, in fact, an association between clinical anxiety and patients' levels of environmental distress. So if you were worried about climate change, you tended to have higher levels of clinical anxiety in general. We also found that when we looked at how daily life and functioning were impacted more concretely, that it had to do with how people were spending time in nature, how they were having fun, and also how they were able to concentrate. And I didn't list it here, but even sleep. And that's because if they started thinking about what was going to happen to the birds that they so loved, or the local park that they really enjoyed, that would take them away from being able to concentrate on other things or being able to sleep. In those that reported environmental distress, 20% reported that it was at least partly why they were in treatment. And this was a finding that I haven't seen in the literature so far. Another thing that I found particularly interesting was that although this was the case, almost no one in the study had brought up their climate distress with therapists. I think this has to do with the kinds of therapeutic spaces that we create where people feel like certain topics are discussable or not discussable. So we know that if we don't ask people about their suicidality, if we don't ask them about traumatic experiences, that they often go undisclosed or undiscussed. And so similarly, I think creating a forum where we say, um, there's so much going on in the world right now, whether it's with politics, race, religion, climate change, are any of those impacting your mental health? This might open the door for people to talk about the climate distress that they may be experiencing. So when we think about how environmental distress may be impacting to clinical outcomes, certainly there might be, direct worries that people are having about climate change that makes them feel depressed. But I think also there may be exacerbation of other social determinants of health that has a more profound impact on their climate distress. And this is an open area of investigation. But we know that people who are impoverished or live in redlined areas, that they live in areas that are more prone to natural disasters. And so likely they may be even more worried about climate change. And the fact that people of color are more interested in talking about climate distress and therapy than their white counterparts may suggest this as well. So what do we do, right? If we have patients who come to us who express climate distress, what actually are interventions? So there are people looking at this, and there are different types of coping strategies that we can try to foster. The first is problem-based coping. And this has to do with trying to get at doing interventions that feel like you're doing something to address climate change. So being part of a tree planting drive or a recycling campaign. And you'll notice I'm saying kind of community level activities. There's actually evidence that being part of a group endeavor is more impactful than just individual action, like planting a tree in your backyard or recycling in your house. To know that you're among others who are thinking about this and doing something is therapeutic. Emotion-focused coping, this has to do with cognitive reframing to try to de-emphasize environmental threats. This is shown kind of through dramatized negative use of emotion-focused coping in the movie Don't Look Up, which, not to give anything away, but for those who haven't seen it, is basically an allegory about climate change, except they're using it in the context of an asteroid coming to hit Earth. And in the movie, we see many ways in which people try to de-emphasize their anxieties about this asteroid that's approaching, but to the point that it actually forestalls them from doing anything about it. That being said, though, if someone is, so distraught or has cognitive distortions around the imminent threat of climate change, trying to do some cognitive behavioral reframing and emotional focused work can be therapeutic. And then the third category, meaning-focused coping. This draws on a person's beliefs, their values, and their goals to foster a positive affect toward environmental issues. And this takes its roots in the work of people like Viktor Frankl and logotherapy. Viktor Frankl had lived during the Holocaust. How do you find meaning in the wake of just abject disaster? But then there's also things like acceptance and commitment therapy. How do you, take the reality as what it is and be able to move forward from it? Honestly, this is partly where I think I find coping with my climate anxiety. By trying to do something and being involved with this research, I feel like it's been helpful with my approaching this whole topic. Another intervention has to do with psychoeducation. So many children are hearing about climate change through different means. They're hearing about it in school, they're seeing it on the news, and they often, don't get the full story. People who have done qualitative analyses of young kids asking about climate change, kids will say, well, is the sun coming closer to Earth? Or, they just won't understand what's happening. So providing resources to caregivers to help children understand what climate change is, but more importantly, to help them know that adults are doing things about climate change. This is a book that the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, which I'm a part of, wrote in collaboration with my brother and sister-in-law, who my brother is a psychiatrist and my sister-in-law is an environmental scientist who's a very accomplished artist as well. So this was an evidence-based book that we wrote on helping parents guide their children through the climate talk, or how to talk about climate change and take their climate anxiety into climate action. Many children may have, and this is true across the board with just children and emotions, but they don't have the words to describe how they're feeling about climate change, alexithymia. And so, can we give them the words to describe their emotions about climate change? And the nice thing about psychoeducation is that it's deliverable in non-clinical settings. This can be done in schools, churches, community centers. So I hope what you're taking away from this topic of environmental distress is that people are worried about what is happening to the world. In fact, the vast majority are, and many, upwards of 60% of young people are very too extremely worried about it. We know that while it may not be impacting the vast majority clinically, that among our patients, there are some who are very worried about climate change, and it may even be impacting why they're seeking mental health treatment. But most of them are not talking to us about it, and if we don't try to create a space where they think they can talk about it, they likely won't. There are interventions that we can start to provide to help people with their climate distress. These include coping strategies and psychoeducation. I've given talks solely on climate distress, and so there's much more to be said about this. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to look at the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is a national nonprofit. Actually, there are multiple branches across the world. They have climate-aware therapy trainings so that you can learn more about the skill sets of how to support youth and adults as well, their caregivers, about climate distress. Other good groups to keep in mind to look at are the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and Connecting Climate Minds. So what do I hope you're taking away from my talk? One is, I know I talked about a lot of ways that climate is negatively impacting mental health, but I hope that I'm also offering you hope that we can study it and try to develop interventions to help our patients with it. Environmental factors affect mental health both directly through biological pathways and through psychological pathways, and research is needed to try to elucidate how these pathways work, to identify risk factors, and to develop interventions. I'm very excited to get to do this work in my lab. I'm always looking for collaborators. And so please reach out to me if this is something of interest to you. Another plug I always like to say is I'm a relatively young researcher. And I've been offered the opportunity to have a lab and grants in this space because I think there's so much need and there are not enough of us doing it. So it's a territory ripe for people to enter into if you're interested in this space. So, please consider this in your research endeavors as well. So with that, I will stop sharing and I look forward to your questions. I'm also going to plug in my computer because it's dying. Give me one moment.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wartzel. While you get your computer charged up, I invite our audience to place their questions in the chat. We've got about 15 minutes of Q&A. I love being able to get us going, and I have so many questions actually about your talk. I was particularly interested in the heat research you're doing. And my question is around whether there's any signal in the literature differentiating temperature from change or delta in temperature. So on the one hand, your research would clearly support the idea of like maybe a community that's borderline hot that gets pushed into extreme heat, right? That would have negative impacts on psychological well-being. But what about like Arctic communities that start low and then maybe are actually being pushed more towards the optimal temperature? I'm wondering if you could address that idea at all.
Yeah, great question. And I'll address the basically two parts of it. One is what are the data on just absolute temperature exposure as opposed to change in exposure. And, as areas that have been cooler move to the more temperate ideal range, what does that mean for their mental health? So, interestingly, there are not really data pointing to absolute temperature being associated with higher rates of suicide. So what do I mean by that? If you look at equatorial countries and their suicide rates, you do not see higher rates of suicide in, say, Mexico versus America. Some of this may be due to reporting and stigma against mental health. So, for example, perhaps places in the Middle East or in India or in China, you may not get accurate levels of reporting of suicide in those areas. But we're not seeing that like, it's a one-to-one, if you've been living in a hotter area from baseline, there are higher rates of suicide. That may be because people get better, they acclimatize to heat stress, and therefore it's really when you have changes in heat stress that you see negative mental health effects. Um, Interestingly, there may be an element to different populations being better able to regulate their temperatures than others. This is a relatively understudied area. It's also fraught with so much history of racism and what does it mean to identify people into racial categories or ethnic categories. But when you look at people who have lived in warmer areas historically than in cooler areas, so I think the study I'm thinking of is looking at people of Asian descent versus, and even that's such broad territory, versus Europeans in a laboratory setting with heat stress. People with a background from East Asia seem to tolerate heat stress more than people from European ancestry. So it may be that there are some differences in sweat efficiency or thermoregulation that come from generations of living in a hot environment. It's a very long-winded way of saying that it's complicated. When we think about going from a cold temperature like Alaska to maybe a more moderate temperature, there are some things that probably improve. Like we talked about, there's that bell-shaped curve with cognition, where maybe you're moving toward that ideal. But when you look at some of the epidemiological literature at how temperature, for example, impacts sleep, it's pretty remarkable how sensitive it is. So basically, once you get past 10 degrees Celsius, so my math on this is going to be bad, but think about like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Anywhere above that the temperature of an area starts to go up, you have negative impacts on sleep. So it's across the range. It's not just the hottest range. Or in the study that we did, in the ED, it picks up when you get to like the really hot areas, but across the board, if it starts to get a little bit warmer, you have negative impacts of insomnia and suicide relationship. So my short answer to that second part of your question is it's also probably complicated in that in some ways, maybe things improve for those people who are at the extreme cold going to moderate, but they likely will also be negatively impacted as well.
Great, thank you. That segues nicely into a question in the chat. This comes from Dr. Coventry, who's one of our second-year child psychiatry fellows. And she writes, the first part of the talk on rising temperature and mental health was compelling. I also worry that public discourse on that research could be interpreted as, quote, high temp is bad for your brain, end quote, and lead to worsening stigma against the global South because people in many of these regions experience very high temperatures year round and are often falsely labeled by the West as lazy or less mentally capable. How could we talk about the real impacts of rising temperatures and mental health in a way that is accessible to the public, but would not exacerbate these stigmas?
Great question. And we know how things get twisted, especially to denigrate already marginalized and underserved people. I guess my answer would be twofold. One is focusing on the change as opposed to the absolute temperature, right? So we know that across the board, whether you're living in a relatively temperate climate to a hot environment, that temperature increases are bad for mental health. And so this is not just the global south, but we're all in harm's way. The second is, I would hope that if anything, we could put this stigma on its head by saying, again, if you're trying to talk to someone that they're labeling people as being lazy or non-productive, maybe there are a number of factors. Taking that supposition is even true, which it's not. But there are many of environmental factors out of the control of the people living in those environments that negatively impact their functioning and mental health. And so we need to be cognizant of this, and we need to try to find ways of supporting everyone who is exposed. I mean, you could say the same thing, a lot of people who are unhoused, right, in America are often labeled in various negative ways, and they're often experiencing the worst of the fluctuations in environmental temperatures. So a great question, and one that we constantly need to keep thinking about how our research is not misconstrued to propagate any number of isms.
Great. A couple of comments about the quality of the talk and the compelling nature of the research. And there's a question here about whether you could comment more on resources for continuing education in this area as clinicians.
Certainly. And thank you to those who provided that feedback. I appreciate that. So I definitely would recommend checking out some of those sites that I mentioned, the Climate Psychology Alliance, the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, its sister organization, and Connecting Climate Minds. There are others as well. I know that a number of different institutions have started to develop in their residency programs curricula for how climate change and environment impact mental health. I think that some of those have been compiled by the climate, why am I blanking on it? The Mental Health Consortium of Climate Change and Mental Health through Columbia. And so you might look on their website to see if there are curricula available through them. The Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, that think tank I mentioned, is actively conducting a study right now. I don't know if they're still recruiting programs for this, but they're recruiting residencies to complete an hour-long didactic that's been developed in a kind of problem-based learning model to teach trainees about how climate change impacts mental health. I'm part of a course I teach at Yale for mental health providers to learn more about this too. That's also a problem-based learning model. So just to say that there are things out there, but because this is such a new field, it's kind of a lot of things that are early in their development.
Great. Another question here from Karina Chamness, one of our nurses. At this time, do you feel there is enough evidence to support adapting clinical support plans, such as nursing advice directing patients towards cooling shelters or supplying concrete cooling supports to patients to stay cool?
Such a great question, Karina. So I'm actually going to step back from that specifically to talk a little bit about the literature on just heat interventions in general. So oftentimes, I've had to give different interviews with the news during the summer, during a heat wave, and they'll say, what can we do? And I've said, well, go to a cooling shelter. Make sure that you know where yours is in your community, and make sure you're staying hydrated, all those things. Well, people have only now started to actually study the effectiveness of those interventions. One guy in particular, Glenn Kenny up in Canada, has done some amazing work in his heat lab. And what he finds is that actually, when you go into a cooling center, you feel good for a few hours, but you kind of bamboozle your body into thinking that it's better than it is when it leaves. So you're actually perhaps at an increased risk of heat stress when you go back. Other things like misting fans or limb immersion have some efficacy when you're looking at temperatures below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. They become less effective when you're going into even hotter ranges. And also with limb immersion, it's not enough to just put your feet in, your whole body has to be in. So, the The short answer is the basic science looking at what interventions are effective is actually still lacking at this point. And so we're not at a place to even go to our patients and say, this is the most effective. Now, that being said, I think it's still important to say, be mindful of trying to stay cool. If you can be in an environment with air conditioning, better, try to use misting fans, be mindful of your hydration status, know that your medicines can make you more vulnerable, as well as we know things like lithium. If you're dehydrated, you can get, toxic. So I think a lot of psychoed is the best we have right now. And there's a need to try to study this better.
All right, I'm hoping I can fit in one additional question here. This is a little bit of a Pacific Northwest centric question, I think. But you mentioned with one of your current studies that involves some using cell phones, that you're collecting ambient light data. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have this. I think a lot of us feel like, well, the summertime is actually the time where people are doing well here because of the light, right? And maybe I'm biased because I grew up in Los Angeles, and I crave and need the sunlight when it comes. But curious to know about your thinking with incorporating ambient light into that study.
Yeah, great question. And this is couched in the whole conversation about seasonal affective disorder, right? Where we know that when it's darker out, you can have significant impacts on depression. You look at winters in Maine versus Florida. There's whatever it is, 2% the population has SAD in Florida versus 20% in Maine. It's always tricky when you do heat studies to account for light, because when you do epidemiological work, where is heat on Earth coming from? It's coming from the sun. And so it can be very hard to disambiguate the two. Another topic that we didn't have time to talk about today is that there's very interesting literature looking at heat interventions to treat mental health. So, some of you may be familiar with kind of like in Sweden, they do these cold plunges, then they go into a sauna. There have also been studies looking at treating non-seasonal affective disorder with like heat lamp therapy. And there's some interesting literature to suggest that might be true. I hope what that suggests to you is that this is complicated, right? The impact of temperature on mental health in the brain is not straightforward. And back to, what that other person was saying, it's not sufficient to just tell the public, hey, hot temperatures equal bad. But with regarding light, what seems to be the case when you try to parse out light from temperature as much as we can with math, basically, it seems like light is beneficial and heat, at least from like the temperature fluctuations that we've been talking about seasonally, is a negative impact. So in Seattle, the impact of having more light may, especially because it's maybe counterposed to it being so dark the other times of the year, it may be so beneficial that we lose the signal of increased temperature on the negative sequelae for mental health in Seattle. Also, the temperatures in Seattle might be relatively mild or benign during the summer, and so we might be, kind of avoiding those ranges that are most detrimental.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk today, Dr. Wurtzel.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.